Hi, Mohammed. Welcome to the Global Conversation.
Thank you, Tawfiq, for having me. Very excited for this.
We're going to find out a little bit about yourself, obviously, during this conversation, but really probe into a lot of different areas. Before we do that, I know that, you have many hats. You're at a think tank, you're an author, you have kind of a corporate profile as well. Why don't you, give some of the viewers just a very, very quick intro. Who is Mohammed Soliman?
It's a very tough question, the toughest
Yeah.
question I
You
get.
can start with the LinkedIn version, then we'll go more existential.
So, I'm a trained engineer, and I have two jobs in Washington, D.C. The first job is I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and I cover AI portfolio and technology infrastructure involved. The second job is I am a director at McLarty Associates. It's a strategy company here in Washington. We advise companies, American companies mostly, on how to go international and advise across the AI, finance, energy, in emerging markets, and the Middle East is part of the portfolio I cover. And on top of all of that, I have a newly released book named West Asia and New American Grand Strategy in the Middle East, and that's why I am talking to you today.
I would talk to you even if you didn't have a book, Muhammad. That's basically and we did. We met a few weeks ago and had a great conversation in person. Muhammad, a lot of the hats you mentioned, some people know those institutions, others don't. One of them, you said McLarty Associates. What is that? What's the genesis of that organization?
So McLarty Associates is a company that was started back in the late 1990s by, at that time, President Clinton's chief of staff, Mac McLarty, and he remains the chairman of the company. And it started as a company that advises U.S. businesses on doing business in Latin America, because Mr. McLarty was also the envoy for LATAM for the president at the time. And then we expanded. We were offering those services to multiple industries across multiple geographies, including the Middle East. And for almost 20 years, the company was called McLarty Kissinger Associates. So they went for a merger with the late Secretary of State Henry Kissinger for a long time. I joined the firm around the divorce between the two ventures,
Hmm.
and it is a kind of industry that is not investment banking, it's not legal advice, it is more strategic advice on how to do business in certain climates, certain markets, how to choose which market you should go to based on what metrics, how to do the market entry, how can you navigate those sort of non-legal questions but important questions to your business, how can you sustain your operations, political risk. So this is the sort of advisory that we offer, and it's not like a unique industry anymore. It was
Yeah.
exotic 25
So
years ago.
what's so it's interesting, right? Because in a way, you talk about Kissinger and Clinton's chief of staff, and they're working, you know, in the shadow world and building connections. And then today, I feel like everybody's doing this. Everybody kind of they went through this process. They went to policy schools. They went to government. Now everybody's in like the shadow world, which is not so shadowy anymore.
It's systematic. There's a methodology for it right now. Also, we live in a world of compliance and risk.
Mm.
So the idea there's some sort of a shadow person that convene behind the scenes meetings. I don't think that this is basically what we're doing. What we're doing is a very much more systematic, by the book operations. Is truly helping businesses when it comes to how should you think about risk, specifically right now, specifically since I would argue Trump came to power in 2016. Questions around trade. Trade is not popular anymore with the American public. So what does it mean for our engagements in Asia? What does it mean when it comes to Iran policy? Because that will have an impact on everything energy related. What does it mean in terms of the rise of the Gulf? Is this an opportunity? And in what sectors? How
So,
about
but
BRICS?
Mohammed, like the last, just even since 2025, when Trump came into office for the second term, you had the USAID be dismantled, right? Or USAID, however people want to say it. You had all these people laid off from the State Department, and they all have this skill set, diplomacy, and they're looking for jobs. So how do you differentiate yourself, or how does anyone from all of these former ambassadors running around, ex diplomats who are like, I know the stakeholders in these countries, I can help you think through this. This is what I did. Um, it feels like we've been flooded with thousands of people with the same profile offering the same stuff.
It's an excellent question. A few things. One is, how can you make yourself commercial? How can you translate your knowledge into something that can be used in corporate America? People are not really interested in a 50-page research paper. People are interested in executive memo about what's the situation right now, cut through the noise, give me actual analysis about what's happening, future scenarios, make a call, make sure that you're able to explain to people real impact on business, how to translate all these major policy inflection points into real business intelligence. This is basically, I would say, the biggest differentiation I see. The second thing is, you also have to make yourself useful. Like, how can you also translate the culture? How can you translate the local dynamics? And when I say translating, more than giving people do's and don'ts in the Middle East, like truly, you need to make sure that people are aware of the dynamics, some of the tensions that exist, some of the personnel. Those things do matter and have an impact on companies that are trying to operate in the region. Those are, I would say, the top two things. And the third thing is, it all depends on the climate, it all depends on the market, because yes, we have a tough labor market here in Washington, D.C., given everything that you have laid out. The new administration in town last year, the layoffs in the federal government, the layoffs in the private
Mm.
sector. So it has been a very tough labor market.
Right. No, it's interesting. Another aspect, in DC, people, they call it, they often call it pejoratively the swamp, right? And, but, the whole world has kind of become DC, right? These ecosystems of think tanks, lobby groups, firms, even some of the firms that we would mention, not just yours, but others, they have offices in Riyadh, in elsewhere. They're now hiring locals, some of them that used to work in the government or in large companies. Are we seeing a DCification of other global capitals?
Let me tell you this. I'm an Arab American in DC, and I think I have seen the life before Brexit and after Brexit. You know what? Is it Brexit? Is it COVID? Is it Trumpism? And all of that. But there is some inflection point in the late 2010s, somewhere there. It's art rather than science. You feel that the global economic energy has basically moved to the Gulf. So it's not really that the rest of the world became DC. It's mainly the rise of the Gulf that's reshaping a lot of the trends. And I say this as someone that, when in my industry people will say we want to go global as an American company, global meant London. That's no longer the case and has not been the case in the past 5 or 6 years. Going global means Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, or Doha. And those cities became much more structured. They have very robust legal systems and requires more of a methodology of engagement rather than let's go do one visit. No, now you have stakeholders. Now you have certain equities for different agencies. Now you need to manage large bureaucracies. Now you also make sure that your headquarter over there will have the right tools to service South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe from over there. So DC is having a moment. And I think that this is a very important inflection point. And it's also shaped by the rise of Asia and shaping
Mm.
Asia. So when you go to Dubai, go ahead.
Yeah. No, no, no. I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, but in then, like you're saying, all this attention has grown on these global capitals, Asian capitals, and just before we go into that, how would you define West Asia? When people hear the word West Asia, what are we talking?
So the way I define it in my book is the system from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean and anything in between. And I'm also arguing that I'm not inventing this, that this has always been the case since before the Portuguese landed in the Indian shores in 1498. that we had a multi-civilizational engagement, like the way Janet Abu Lughd in her great book Before European Hegemony, the famous map, when you have all these circles around the sub regions, Mediterranean intersecting with Cairo and then Red Sea, and then around the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean. Those civilizations have been there, and for quite some time, actually for centuries, because of the British hegemony, it was kind of organized. It was organized systematically around British interest and the British Empire to sustain this maritime-based empire from London, Gibraltar, Suez, India, and then Singapore. And with the end of the Second World War and then the beginning of the Cold War kind of froze the existing lines. You did not really have those sort of systems getting together again because of the Cold War and the very idea for where are you when it comes to the fight between the Soviet Union and the United States and NATO. And I think this system started to return to West Asia rather than just the Middle East after the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the globalization in 1990s, because this is the era of free trade. This is the beginning of the rise of the Gulf with the Dubai model. This is basically when you start to feel that the borders that once separated the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, Indian Ocean are collapsing. And I can give you examples that basically give this more evidence. Think about trade. The trade between India and the European Union is close to $130 billion in terms of goods. Add on top of that almost $40 billion in terms of services. So in total, let's say 170, $180 billion. And they had just a trade deal between India and EU. The trade between India and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE alone, is $100 billion. That will be doubled in the next 5 years. Trade between India and Saudi Arabia is around 43, $45 billion. That would be doubled in the next 5 years. That means that just the India GCC trade itself alone is almost equivalent, even more than than the EU India trade. So that's a factor. The second factor is demographics, and this is an important piece here. You have 9 million Indians in the Gulf. You have 4.5 million Pakistanis in the Gulf. On top of that, think about the number of European citizens that moved to the Gulf recently. Think about the role that Gulf plays as capital provider for so many of the big ticket items across that system. AI infrastructure in France, in Italy, in Greece. The biggest in Hindi LLM is being ran out of Abu Dhabi. So there's a lot of things that are being shaped around the rise of the Gulf, but also represents this sort of transformation of the Middle East into West Asia.
Right, right. No, it's an interesting concept. I mean, I have a concept around kind of Middle Earth where I also blend in North Africa and a bit of East Africa into that kind of part of the world where, obviously the demographics are also leaning in that favor as you have demographic decline around the world. And this is where you still have growth areas, you have young populations, which are then consumer markets, and then leads to that further integration, especially with the Gulf at the center, because it's the nexus between some of those people. It's interesting you mentioned, the British Empire. Obviously, we're having a conversation that will be released, and we don't know when. And so, going into the specifics of current events is not, too great. But in the recent Iran war, I wrote a long article, and I went back into the history of Cyrus the Great, right? And I looked at the March of Alexander the Great, that happened a few hundred years later. And in one decade, he goes right from the Mediterranean all the way, into South Asia. And then, of course, about 2,000 years later, you have the Mongols. I say 2,000, but 1,500 years later, you have the Mongols coming in the other direction. So this terrain, it's very interesting. Almost, through some very tectonic forces, became integrated actually historically. But it was from both east and west directions. Do you think people in these regions understand a lot of this history?
I'm not an expert on education systems across those nations. I can tell you, for example, I did study my undergrad in Cairo
Mm-hmm.
and my high school in Cairo. And the history that was taught there is very Egypt centric viewpoint
Mm,
on its own history, on the fight with the French, and how there's
mm.
a big inflection point the
So
French
like the
Revolution,
modern nationalism kind
the
of
modern
type of.
nationalism, very strong emphasis on the pharaonic heritage of Egypt. So, no, I don't believe that the Egyptians, for example, do not understand history or do not study history from their own point of view. They have their own point of view on this. And I would argue, based on the younger generation of people that I have seen in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Qatar, no, I do see people that are very much aware of who they are, where they come from, their lineage, their story, their struggle, and their understanding of history. For example, when you go talk to someone in Saudi Arabia, you will talk about the first Saudi state, the second Saudi state. There's a reason why the Saudi state is very much focused on a national identity, uh, even the idea of Saudi Arabia before Islam, Arabia before Islam. So there is more of recognition of digging into history and making sure that
Mm.
we're aware of where did we come from and what's the
Well,
future.
it's interesting because in Saudi, right, you had the Al Ula project, right, and you're going to the Nabateans, right, and then you have the in Daria, you're creating the UNESCO World Site of where in Najd the Saud family comes from, right, and so there's this deepening that always seems to happen in a lot of these, particularly in the Middle East, right, where you go primordially ancient and you go to like the last 100 years, but there's something like this gap like whenever I'm in Egypt, nobody talks to me about the Fatimids. And then I go to like Cairo and I look at the street signs and why are these street signs naming those street signs? And it's like there's this gap of this civilizational through line that I find.
Yeah.
Um, why do you think that is?
I mean, I love the Fatimid state. I think it's one of the most favorite states that for people in my class in Cairo love. So I would argue it depends on who you're talking to, right? Maybe it is ideological, right? Also, maybe because it's a living history. Egyptians live in a city that's very ancient. So good luck trying to go tell members of my family that there's a certain layers to this building beyond what their day-to-day use. If you're living in if you're living in a very ancient city, it is not really history for people. It's not really history. It is basically the living reality in a sense. And then people use certain periods to confirm some of the ideological and political bias. And for a country like Egypt, you have so many civilizations, so many states that you pick and choose what's your favorite, right? Like, who's your favorite leader in the history of Egypt? What's your favorite period in the history of Egypt? What was your worst enemy in Egypt's history? Like, I mean, you have such a very deep civilization that you can pick and choose wherever you want, and it's 120 million people, so you cannot really also ensure conformity around a very specific narrative about the country.
What I find interesting about kind of the whole thesis you have around West Asia and kind of this reorientation or reimagination or reconfirmation uh, of this identity, these trade routes, the way the flows are actually already going, uh, is it is also happening at a time where people are redefining sovereignty, and at a time where they're understanding what they are as a nation in the global order, and what are transnational links, and what is regional kind of integration. Um, and that's a process that we talk about the nationalist movements, right, from 100 years ago, from 50 years ago. That's kind of a spent kind of thing. Now we're in this new reimagination period, and so that concept of what this means also beyond the nation is also part of that. um, how do you see that conversation? How do you see this kind of reorientation of nationalism and sovereignty occurring at the same time as this concept of West Asia?
I'm an engineer, and just by the DNA of my studies, I am a structuralist, I am a realist, and I believe in systems. This is basically how I define history, how I define the discourse of geopolitics. The second thing is, in my book West Asia, I'm not trying to bring Edward Said to geopolitics. This is not Orientalism fused with geopolitics. This is a real politique book that's trying to come up with a realist approach to the region for American policymakers and also for policymakers across this region as I define it. What I mean by all of this, I mean I trying to differentiate between the rise of the Gulf and the increasing economic integration and flow of people and the question of national identity. I don't think both are. I think there is a very strong Gulf identity. I believe right now we are in an era where you have the non-Western nations are going through a very strong sense of self-awareness and identity based on the rise, based on their economic performance, based on their own security surroundings. And I don't see them trying to redefine this national character because of their newly found role in the global economy as the place where you have capital and people and businesses located.
Hmm. It's an interesting one because uh, we spent a lot of time in the Gulf. I think we've crossed paths there, and I think you've worked in a number of places, also in not just in West Asia, like in Mexico, right, and other places. So I think that's why I enjoy our conversations because we can have a global think, right, about the different circumstances. You know, I've been also watching what's happening in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. Um, Afghanistan, Syria, you really have this reconstruction ongoing, the states are being reoriented and restructured. And I had an article at the beginning of last year called "The Last Two Ideas Left on Earth: Islam and America." And I always make I go like far like that. But in some senses, these countries are actually looking around and saying, what is the model I choose, right? Is it this prosperity oriented Western model or is there something else? And something else is entering the frame, whether we like it or not, or think about it or not. There's this subtle re-architecture starting to form. And I don't know where Afghanistan goes. They're having this ongoing, always conflict with Pakistan. So there's like a confrontation of these models. You have Syria, that's building. And in a weird way, Syria is oppositional to Lebanon. If Syria is like, we're building this pseudo Islamic state that's technocratic. Um, how do you see these state systems being recreated? So not just from a national identity. Do you think there's some deeper conversation coming? And even if you just started to put one more thing into your frame, because you mentioned Edward Said, Edward Said's conversation himself is almost Orientalist, because everything he's doing is in response to how West looks at the East. It's not a conversation from within the East. And so I wonder if this will create a conversation that transcends or moves past, Edward Said.
You got me. You got me. You tricked me. I really enjoyed the conversation, really, truly. But at the same time, I'm struggling because this is very, very intellectually tough question. I think if I get to guess, and I'm not really well versed, like this is not a question that I deeply thought about it. But you're correct. I lived in Mexico City, and I think living in a city where like I was the only brown guy who doesn't speak Spanish in the street of Mexico City. That was a very interesting experience, and I love Mexico. It's one of my favorite. But being there and seeing this Latin American country culture and observing it visually rather than verbally, just by the virtue that I don't speak the language, gives you a different perspective on things. And combine this with being American and seeing the changes in America. I lived in Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I go travel to Asia, and based on all these sort of engagements across literally virtually every continent on Earth, there is some sort of a crisis, and this crisis, is it post-liberalism? Is it? It feels like it. It feels that we are entering a post-liberal framing of things. And in this phase, people are trying to look for anchor identity or an anchor fact for their whole existence and to orient their societies around. So let's talk about states and then maybe go to the individual. I think this crisis of liberalism or post liberalism is one of the key drivers for the rise of the civilizational states. How I define civilizational states: those are the countries that can predate their own story to longer, ancient, rooted history. So you end up with the Egyptians, the Turks, the Indians, the Russians, the Chinese, that we're civilizational states. And this is a response to the crisis of liberalism. And there's a piece that I wrote on the Middle East Institute website 5 years ago and talking about this. That, and at that time, I made the prediction that you're going to have more and more states trying to dig deep into their history and trying to figure out what's a founding story. We need a deeper, much more rooted founding story to our country, to our society, and that will shape how we think about our own future discourse. That's how I see it.
So, it's interesting, right? Like, obviously, and in this conversation, but if we're with, some of our colleagues who are at think tanks who sit around, writing, everything is politics, right? Everything is geopolitics, some social cultural stuff, and you get into all these debates. And in DC, you get into strange debates that then over time, if me and you go to like the meetings and other, we're like, that's not kind of how nobody's sitting around having that discussion. And there's other things that drive change, transformation, decisions. So we'll get to kind of money and capital flows, which I think is a very big one, right? And a lot of people in our circles, sometimes in some of our circles, we have a Venn diagram, um, don't fully capture. But technology, geopolitics is a visceral force. But technology is also a visceral force. I mean, it completely remakes the map, literally, figuratively. How do you think about technology, and how you think about it, not just in obviously America, but then as it pertains to Asia and West Asia? Um, are we overstating its impact, or are we understating it? What do we mean by it?
You're an author, so you're going to relate to what I'm going to say. Whenever an author being asked if she or he had a favorite chapter in their book, they deny it. They say, "No, I loved all the chapters." I
Just
am
like your
gonna
kid,
lie.
you can't have a favorite kid. Is that
I do have a favorite chapter in my book, and this is the chapter on AI infrastructure. I loved it. It was great because it captures my journey in this. Because I think AI was foundational to the West Asia thesis. Let me start with how I think about technology, because this you're getting me excited, and then I'm going to tell you how I see West Asia fits in. I think since the end of the great discoveries of new geographies on Earth, we were no longer in the business of the frontier, exploring the frontier, until we had the space race, until we sent humans to outer space, and of course, the moon landing. And then I think right now, or actually since the beginning of the internet, for the past more than 30 years ago, I think technologies became a frontier, became a geography in a mean sense. That now we're in an era where information networks almost equivalent to new territories, to a new frontier. And this is how I think about all the different new iterations of technology. And on top of that, you also start to have a generational change in the national security apparatus in the way they're thinking about technology and interdependence and national security. And then we also had another inflection point that was important, which is that since we never had two great powers who are technologically intertwined. That was never the case between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was absolutely not the case at all. We had very
right?
few
Separate.
trade links between United States and the Soviet Union. I'm not going to say it was zero, but nothing compared to the U.S.-China dynamics. Maybe between the European powers before and after the wars, sure, but that was a different scale. So when you have these two great powers very intertwined, then the question of technology takes always a national security aspect. And you have seen the different inflection points. You started with, first and foremost, the Obama the Obama Xi summit on cybersecurity. That was right before he left the White House. Then we have Trump one in the White House when we had the Clean Network Initiative, the American crusade against Chinese infrastructure in 5G, and literally forcing allies and partners to divest from
Hmm.
Chinese
Huawei.
hardware,
Yeah.
Huawei and ZTE, and we sanction companies, Huawei and ZTE. Right now, people taking the idea of going after companies for like as this is the normal. But back in the day, in 2017, 2018, that was shocking to people in industry. And then, basically, with every new technologies that are being introduced, the question of what does it mean for great powers, what does it mean for US-China dynamic, is becoming front and center. And now, fast forward, it's all about export controls in town. Whenever you are, I mean, a few years ago, if you ask people
Right.
about export control, that doesn't really register with people, doesn't really register with the white collar professionals in DC.
Mm.
Fast and forward, moving to 2022 in October when Jake Sullivan gave his famous speech on export control and the way we're thinking about uh, uh, limiting limiting our own exports of AI, semiconductors, GPUs to China. This is when the whole thing completely changed. That technology is core to the competition. Actually, competition is almost exclusively organized around the question of technology because technologies are seen as a state power. That the way you measure your state power now is how much compute do you have right now? You have gigawatt compute. I mean, the United States has 70 to 80 gigawatt compute that we can use for commercial reasons. We can use it for military aspects. The Chinese have about 15 to 18 gigawatt. So what does it mean for you as a state, right? Do you have smart systems? Do you have new logistics? Are you able to use physical AI? Those became state power questions rather than
Mm.
just commercial questions.
So what happens to, the whole nature of autarky? So the other day I was having a conversation with somebody, and they were praising Kim Jong Un in North Korea. They're like, "Oh, maybe they've done a good job." They're like, "I'm reevaluating Kim Jong Un." And for a long time, we when we think about economics and coming into this play of geopolitics and technology, it's like, well, the autarkic state that's not normal. We're talking about trade, but then you look at the trajectory of the last 10 years. How are you, going upstream on the chemicals and the precursors? How are you going on the critical minerals? Where can you manufacture explosives? Are you able to do RDX in the United States at the rate that you need to if you're engaging in war? Then we haven't even gotten into, like, robotics, and that's a hugely complex supply chain if you want to build those at scale, and if your militaries are dependent on humanoid robots, which I don't think is so far away. Obviously, we have the drones that are doing fighter jets without pilots, but you're going to have humanoid military robots entering into cities. What does that mean? Does that increase the flow? Does it make it? When you talked about civilizational states, I have a term called geopolitical spheres. Do you kind of create? Are there spheres that get created around, similar places, or is this like just a U.S. China thing and everybody else is just connected with each other?
I wrote a piece a few years ago and I said, don't assume that there is going to be a new norm. It's always going to be very gray and very intertwined. And it's very hard for me to tell you there's going to be one general line. So, what I mean by this? I mean, it's going to be a mix of both. It's going to be a mix of US, China as two big techno-economic powers, which that's absolutely true. That's the case. But you're also going to have players that are going to be trying to build some smaller coalitions around certain supply chain, from minerals to building compute capacity to deployment of physical systems into their own economies and militaries, more importantly. So you're going to have mix of both. Because at the end of the day, right now we're in an era of system building. We're in an era of system building. We're building a system of techno industrialization that's completely different than what we had since the Industrial Revolution. This is different because the moment you start having physical AI doing things, being part of the economic productivity aspect of your economy, I would say that this is an inflection point on its own.
It's like we would push, when we would be having these type of conversations, if were sitting in 2012 or 11, it would be a little bit more like sci-fi, we're projecting. But now, honestly, if you're advising a client on a 5-year strategy, you talk about Vision 2030. I mean, obviously, I'm all about 2040s. If you go to Vision 2040, you have to actually have this conversation. You got to say, who's my tax base? Who's actually working? Who's part of my workforce? How do they fit into society? Um, that's I was talking to somebody the other day about how many robots do we think there's going to be, by over the next 5 years, right? In the world. What would you say? How many robots, humanoid robots, do you think exist in the world in 5 years?
For my friends who were skeptical of the idea of physical AI as reality, I usually force them to go with me and take a robo taxi ride.
Hmm. Like a
I think,
Waymo?
yes, and the moment you do it, I think it changes people's psyche. I was absolutely skeptical. I think 5 years ago, I was absolutely skeptical of self-driving cars. If you and I had this and I have no problem admitting that I do
Yeah.
change opinions every now and then whenever I see things. I usually, if I have a new input, automatically that will update my framework. But a few years ago, if you and I had this conversation in 2021, and you told me, Muhammad, robo taxis, self-driving cars are the future, I'll be very skeptical. I will say, um, listen, I don't know. I don't get the safety and security. I don't get the models. I'm not sure about the latency. Like I'm not sure. Right now, it's just absolutely fascinating to see how they're deployed at scale in cities and going global. And I think this is an indication for what's a new what's a new industry floor, what's a new factory floor. I think the factory floor is going to be based on compute capacity in data centers and physical AI deployment for actual heavy lifting economic activity. This is how I see the two pillars of this sort of techno industrialism phase that we're going through right now.
I saw a chart the other day that said 80% of consumer spending in the US comes from 10% of the population. So if you look at this chart from the 1980s, it's basically reversed, and then coming out of the global financial crisis, it was then it converged again. But now you're talking about that 10% is spending. And when you look at AI and then you talk about physical AI, right? Physical AI will really have a replacement effect on a lot of labor. The need and value of labor is a lot less, right? And so once you start integrating into kind of countries, and we talk about small populations, large populations, or sovereign rulers, right? Who obviously in the Gulf, they've imported a lot of labor. Uh, it starts to redefine what a country is, how it grows as GDP, which is based obviously on a lot of people and consumption. But now, if consumption is happening from very few people, and the people that you need for labor actually don't need to be people anymore. And we're talking very, very close to that in a lot of cases, not everything, obviously. Um, does that reorient, your thinking at all? How you think of a country, where you put investment, how you grow a vision for your future?
I have a framework, and I also have questions because I don't think my framework is solid because there are a lot of
Mm, of course.
variables. But one, what are the sort of countries that will be attractive and well situated for the next 20 years? A, countries that have compute. And the way I define compute, just to make sure I'm very clear here, is not just semiconductors. Compute for me is semiconductors. It's the energy grid that can sustain gigawatts of compute. And on top of that, the capital flow for that capex, for that capital investment. So this is how you have to build compute because you need compute for your own economy, for you to export tokens, so you basically centralize nodes of techno industrialism around your own local economy rather than other way around. You're also able to make sure that your own population is very much ready for this next phase. When I say ready, I don't really mean that you get them all of them hooked on Anthropic and OpenAI. This is part of it, that they're able and they are AI. Can use AI tools, but do you have their DNA? Can you make sure that you are ready for the next revolution when it comes to biotechnology and your population health?
Hmm.
And then on top of that, how about deployment of physical AI at scale across the socioeconomic layers of your society? So this is basically the framework about which countries will do better. And when you basically have that sort of framework, you will look into like a list of 15, 17 countries. Of course, you have the usual suspects, like United States, you're going to have China, you're going to have Taiwan, Japan, Korea. I would say the Gulf states there. You have the Emiratis, absolutely, the Qataris, the Saudis. You have the big five in Europe, France, Italy, of course, Germany. I'll put Poland there. I'll put the Baltic states there. So you're always going to have those sort of countries that are always going to be ready for this next iteration, and then there are other countries you're going to have a question about their performance. But how about the questions that are unanswered? Like I gave you the framework. Here are some questions that I think we should answer. Should think about answering them, and I have no answers for. One, how are we going to count the country's GDP? How can we count that? B, will you include Asians as part of a country's population or not? Like, will AI Asians be part of our math in terms of population? I don't know yet. Like, I have no answers for those questions I'm just laying out. Three, what does physical AI do to state power? I think I have views, but we don't know yet. Again, it was not really used. Yeah, sure, we can make drones, but I don't think drones represent the peak of what physical AI means for state power. So those are the three big questions I'm thinking about in terms of like the unanswered questions for AI and state power in the next 20 to 30 years.
I mean, it's an interesting one, right? Because you have, a big inflection point around gunpowder and the industrialization of gunpowder, into Europe, half a millennium ago, and you have nuclear weapons, 80 years ago. That at least it didn't change everything, but it kind of created this marker of separation of power. And I think you're right that we don't fully understand physical AI in defense yet. People think they do, but actually what's coming is probably even further and more different. But it is probably a step change that will start creating separation realities. And those separation realities, I mean, it's interesting you talked about the GDP calculation. Those separation realities allow you to create economic power as well. And so that's visceral changes, right? So amidst all of this, we know that there's going to be the visceral, and probably we could have like 3 hours where we just talk about what I just mentioned. We could go deep and bring some people in. um, and you're in the middle of this, and I've seen some of this. You have hundreds of billions of dollars and probably now trillions of dollars being allocated into this compute, physical AI supply chain, nexus. And we can come up with some examples and things. How are you seeing the size of the capital being allocated to this? What do you think? Is it an opportunity? Is it a risk? Um, is there corruption? Is it going to succeed? Because it's a lot.
It's a tough question. Let me add a disclaimer. I am not an investment advisor, so do not take my answers or my viewpoints as personal advice on how can you manage your finances or your investment. Here's how I think about it. Right now, we have about 70 to 90 gigawatt compute, give or take, and depends on how you count it. Like 70 to 90 gigawatts. For us to keep in line with the increasing demand, that will come from personal AI. When I say personal AI, that means an AI powered glasses. That means an AI gadget on your jacket
Okay, I
that
thought you meant like
records
an
your
AI suit. I was very curious what an
whatever,
AI
like
suit would look like.
anything that's personal AI that's
Yeah.
basically acting as giving you AI services and
Hmm.
support. That's already going to be an iteration, an evolution of AI. Because so far, what's our own interaction with AI? It's like basically the screens. It's basically
Right.
our phone. It's your laptop, right? You are doing something on a chatbot, or you're basically doing your coding. So personal AI will be an iteration. And after that iteration, you're going to have the physical AI deployment at scale. And we started to see that with robo-taxis, right? Which is like not really a crazy idea. We have robo-taxis in the street. Just for us to keep up with just that demand in the next 5 years, we need to jump from the 70 to 90 gigawatt compute to anywhere between 220 to 300 gigawatt compute. Between 220 to 300 gigawatt compute just in the next few years. And let me add something here. Every gigawatt compute, every gigawatt, just 1 gigawatt, is anywhere between 30 to 50 billions in capex, just to basically get the semiconductors, and you have the energy, and you have the construction, and I mean, just to have this 1 gigawatt compute online is 30 to 50 billion dollars. Why I'm putting this out there? Because I do think actually we are not investing enough in building the compute infrastructure to enable us to keep up with that sort of pace of AI deployment at scale. This being said, and just make sure I'm very clear here, it doesn't mean that you don't have some bad investments. It doesn't mean that you don't have a speculative compute, because also we have to care about what's the corporate structure of those investments. There's a difference between Microsoft building compute, right, and some other, I would say, new investors trying to build a speculative compute. And by the way, the asset will be utilized. Maybe they will not have the right returns for them as investors, but the asset itself will be utilized. Absolutely.
Well,
Um,
it's interesting because I've been thinking about this, and I need to go really deep into AI the next few months, like in a much deeper way, right? Rather than the surface, because I'm starting to just think about this a little bit more during the conflict, but also elsewhere. You had physical effects on power stations, and AWS kind of went down a little bit. And I start thinking about how does the physicality affect, the digital world, right? With those risks. Then I look at what Michael Burry says about circular, deals, right, that are happening, between NVIDIA, OpenAI, and other things. Uh, I don't know if you read Howard Marks's memo on is it an AI, is it a bubble, right? Which is obviously this whole debate that people have. But the two things that were interesting to me was Grok and XAI just restructured their entire approach and founding team, and it just showed me that the progress is not linear, number one, right? And they actually haven't cracked the full, they actually don't know fully what comes next, right? And so we're vested in this thing. We're talking about the gigawatts, 10xing or even more. I agree with you. We're at the beginning, but we're also at the beginning of the beginning, right? And this whole LLM, based transformer model, that's also the first, you know we this is where we're leading into. I invested in a couple AI companies in 2018 where you weren't here yet. And Jan LeCun, who people may like or not like, just raised, right, I think $1 billion to start thinking about, is there another way to do AI? And so one of the things about fast change, Mohammed, is we're building this whole structure. Do we know that this is the structure actually that's going to be going in 5-7 years, or could we have a different structure with different supply chains and different needs, and you know not maybe the same type of data centers or et cetera?
you're asking the right question,
Mm.
and I'm going to give you the worst answer from a podcast guest. I don't know.
Mm.
This being said, you have to make a bet,
Yeah.
and those bets are informed by, of
Right.
course, research. They're not haphazard,
Mm.
but you do have the compute, because you need compute, because you need
Yeah.
centralized systems that service, would say, like hundreds of megawatt of workloads that you need. Right? You need that. In the same time, yes, you will have a need for edge AI, on device compute, right? Because you need this for your personal, maybe for personal intelligence, maybe for your phone. You don't really need, some extent, and you're going to have new versions of phones where you don't really need to go have to send a query to some random data center. I think you're going to have some devices that are much more wired for compute on device situation. And actually, you will also have a lot of AI scientists investing in non-GPU architecture, on other architectures for AI. Is this the best way to do AI? I am personally, and I cannot disclose that, but I do advise an AI lab that's literally trying to work through the idea of what's the best way of doing AI beyond the question of GPU architecture. So you're going to have all of these things together, but the endpoint is still the same. You need compute capacity. Either that compute will be edge, will be centralized. That's a different question. But you need to invest that way because this is, I would argue, this is a big inflection point for the way we're doing economic activity and the deployment of these technologies at scale across military, economy, social life that requires a lot of supply from different sorts of compute.
Mm. So, I want to pose a question to you that somebody asked me today. And there's a lot of change going on in all types of ways. New opportunities are being unlocked. Geographies are shifting, right? The centrality of certain geographies are becoming more apparent. Geographies that previously weren't cosmopolitan are more cosmopolitan than geographies that were previously cosmopolitan. Um, and there's a lot of polarization, right, that occurs in these times of change and so forth. And they asked it, where would you choose to live if you could live in this world? What city? What country? And so if you, were to answer that question, knowing all of this, where would you see, or what are the two, three places you would see for yourself or advise others?
If you are under the age of 30, I have a list of cities that you should consider living there for a period of time. And it all depends on your personal choices, but I have a rationale. But let me start with the cities: New York, Washington, D.C., Berlin, Dubai, Tokyo, Mexico City. I would add Istanbul to that list as well. And why I mentioned those cities? I think those are the cities that have, and of course, SF, sorry, how dare I? Those are the cities that are very much international, are a big driver for change on a global level. Their art, cultural, movies, tech, AI, finance. And when you live there, you basically maximize your global exposure at a younger age. You're exposed to different ethnicities, different cultural trends, different tech trends. You get exposed to different sorts of people and social classes and social groups in ways that other cities do not have. That's basically my take on where to live. Meaning, and this is kind of where I try to do in my 20s. And I think Mexico City has been a fantastic city for me because of the very idea that it was one of those cities that's very impactful on culture, on art, a rising city economically, and I don't speak the language, so seeing that was very important to me. So this is my recommendation for folks. But then right now, in my mid 30s, late 30s, and you're asking me a question, where do I see myself, my family, with our kid going to live? I would pick Tokyo. The same way I picked Mexico City, because it is Tokyo for me is it's a city that's dear to my heart. I love going to Tokyo. I love Japanese culture. Even in my book West Asia, you'll see Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, is there front and center to my book because I do appreciate the Japanese way of strategy of reorienting geography around east to west rather than north to south. And I'm using that model in my book West Asia. But the reason why Tokyo is truly you feel that there is a different sort of modernity in Tokyo on Japanese terms. There's modernity, there is the future is actually a real thing in Japan, and you feel it's real, it's present, but also very much rooted in Japanese culture and Japanese identity. That's different than other cities. You get a different feeling in Tokyo than Berlin or New York. And on top of that, you also have this. Of course, 2026, no one really is truly a stranger anywhere because we're all online. We're all now digital creatures. It's one of those cities that you truly feel like you are on your own. You're no longer in New York. You are no longer in Berlin. You are no longer. You really need to be involved in Japanese day to day life to survive. And so it's a really impressive experience. So if I would pick a city to go there and write a book and engage with a completely different culture and civilization, I would argue it is Tokyo. And on top of that, the food is absolutely wonderful over there.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean that's it's very interesting because you went to the heart of an importance of culture, city, and the physical environment, right? Which is, I think, interesting. Where to turn to when we had this wide-ranging conversation, especially on technology. Let me ask you a question that I close all of our conversations with, Muhammad. Across a lot of this, the trends we talked about, the geopolitics, technology. If you were to fast forward yourself to 2040, what do you see? Do you see, and obviously I'm not going to hold you to it, but if we meet in 2041, we will. Do you see one global state? Do you see, robots everywhere? What do you see in 2040 across all of this? Where we live?
I'm going to make controversial statements.
Please.
Among my friends who are techies and engineers, I'm the one person who doesn't believe in AGI. I don't even know what AGI is. I believe in compute. I do believe that compute will be used to turn traditional systems into smart systems. And if I'm making a bet on 2040, I do make a bet that you're going to have more deployment of compute across all the traditional systems. And yes, you're going to have robots. Not really in the sci-fi sense, a Skynet sense. I'm a bit skeptical of the Oppenheimer slash Skynet dark scenario of AI. I think I'm much more. Uh, I feel good about deployment at scale in certain industries, and I think it will be hopefully good for humanity. So that's the first thing. You're going to have more smart systems, more robots deployed at scale. Second, I still believe the nation state will still be there. We're still going to have a nation state. I think that nation state might adjust to new and different inflection points. Depends on how technology progress and get deployed. But I still believe nation states will be there in 2041 when we get to meet together. You and I still have to need passports, and we need still to have immigration officer to allow us to meet somewhere. Three, I think this is basically the one thing that I'm not sure about, which is I think the social separation. I think we're going to enter into a very isolated society. And if you think that today we have a social crisis in terms of an anxiety or people being on their own, I think this problem will actually increase significantly with more technologies being deployed. That's also third big bet I have.
Interesting. Well, I will send you a calendar invite for 2041 for us to meet in Tokyo, and we'll have a conversation there over some good food, Muhammad.
I'm all for
Um,
it. I wish we still
well,
have Outlook then.
yeah. Well, great to have you here. Obviously, we'll be seeing each other in person, I'm sure, sometime soon. But also, it's great to have this conversation virtually, Muhammad, and looking forward to our next round.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate the conversation.